we can stand behind a number that we've said, you could save this much just on this building. Across the whole portfolio, you could save this much. In our industry, you save £1 on the opex and you add £20 to the valuation of the building. So that kind of that messaging, once it becomes a real number that's based on their portfolio or that's based on that specific building that they own and operate, that's where it becomes very, very compelling.
Grace, thank you for doing this. So tell us about your background. Give us an intro, your experience in procurement.
Okay, so I started off in procurement not really knowing what that meant, quite frankly. I finished university and knew that I wanted to live in London. And so I moved to London and got a job, was lucky enough to get a job with at a boutique kind of procurement consultancy firm that was just really looking for somebody who spoke Spanish, because one of their key clients had recently purchased an operational real estate platform in Spain. They deliberately they weren't looking for somebody with procurement experience based in the UK. And so I kind of learned everything from scratch. And in that time, I was very lucky to do some really great secondments in clients' offices, kind of heading up that operational procurement role, and really developed my understanding, not just of procurement, but procurement within the operational real estate sector. So essentially, my background has always been focused on institutionally owned residential rental real estate. And once that becomes operational, how can we move the needle on the opex through strategic procurement and through economies of scale to essentially ensure that we are boosting net operating income as much as we possibly can for our investor clients, and in turn then raise that net asset valuation of their real estate portfolios. So not necessarily through driving revenue, but actually we realized that there was a need for expertise in reducing cost in a more strategic way.
That's a great way to begin, just by knowing Spanish, then moving into procurement and then learning it through doing it, really. And as he said, much of your career has been spent and mostly in the rental space, BTR, co-living, student accommodation. So tell us about that. Why did you stay in that vein of procurement rather than, most people move into the construction side, you've remained on the operational side? Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a good question, really. I felt that the operational side was kind of neglected in terms of strategic procurement. And I think that in the institutionally owned kind of residential space, that continues to be the case. And I think that is, that's part of the great work that we do at Area Alternative Real Estate Advisors. So we have an investment and brokerage team, we have an asset management team, and then I run the strategic procurement team. So we are kind of the only consultancy firm in the market that is really, truly cradle to grave for our investor clients. That procurement element, once the building is operational, is just missing in the sector. I don't feel that the strategic procurement element is missing from the pre-construction stage necessarily. Of course, there's always room for improvement. I think that one of those improvements could be particularly where you've got an integrated developer, investor, operator, to bring in insights from the operational team into those pre-construction and those design decisions. We could still see more improvement in that. But in terms of strategic procurement, once the thing is built and it's full of residents and we're trying to introduce cost control measures, but we're also trying to ensure resident retention and resident satisfaction and compliance and health and safety and all of these great responsibilities that we have as building operators. Actually, what is lacking is the support of somebody who can build a partnership, a suite of supply chain partnerships. I think that's what's really lacking. So that's why I've always kind of stayed in that post-construction area. It also means that you can achieve the economies of scale because it's going to be very rare, unless I suppose you're in Dubai at the moment, where there are tens of thousands of operational real estate units being constructed simultaneously. However, if we're appointed on a portfolio of 20,000 units that are live and operational, imagine the economies of scale through the supply chain that we can achieve just through that unit concentration. So there are just great opportunities there. And, we've done some great work already since I joined Area in August. And we are now kind of in that next strategic phase of how do we really cement our service offering and clarify our service offering to really get ourselves out there and to educate the wider sector around the need for strategic procurement.
As you say, there sounds like a real need in that side of procurement, the operational side post-construction. So really interesting that you focus on that area and so much opportunity for improving those outcomes. So there might be people that are in a different area of procurement that might be familiar and yet might assume that your area of procurement post-construction is comparable to theirs, but in a more general sense. And yet there are significant differences, different ways of doing it. So let's imagine that you're at a dinner party. You get asked by somebody that's in procurement about what you actually do. How do you begin to respond to that question?
Gosh, it's a great question. Honestly, when I'm at dinner parties and people ask what I do and I reply procurement, they normally move on to asking the next person what they do. So it never really gets to that, JJ, to be completely honest. I suppose I summarize it by saying our core service offering is to reduce cost, to increase net operating income, to increase compliance, to increase operational efficiency, and to increase resident satisfaction in the rental real estate market. And I still get met with blank faces. And then I kind of lose my patience and I say, I buy things and I negotiate service contracts for blocks of flats. Okay.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
And then move into the conversation following that.
But it is fascinating. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but it is fascinating when you speak to somebody who kind of understands that, with whom either procurement or operational real estate resonates with that person, then you can have a really interesting discussion. But it's kind of, our, the alternative asset classes, build to rent, purpose-built student accommodation, less so, but build to rent and co-living are really quite new as concepts in the UK market. We're talking less than 20 years. This sector has really been around as an asset class. And so that's already a niche. Then strategic procurement, and strategic procurement not in the way that people think about it in the NHS, or nothing disparaging about procurement in the NHS, but that kind of regular, what we think of when we think of a category manager and a buyer and a preferred supply chain and tier 1 and tier 2, and it's very much supplier onboarding and I don't think that it really revs anyone's engine to think about procurement, because if anyone's worked in a large organization, I can guarantee you they've probably had a degree of frustration with the procurement team in terms of there are unnecessary guardrails. This is, it's kind of hindering innovation, and we're trying to expedite a project, and we're coming up against blockers. That's been the feedback, at least to me, around procurement. And I suppose what Area is trying to do and what I'm trying to do in our already niche sector is to actually take a bit more of a niche attitude to procurement and use strategic procurement to boost net operating income rather than to slow down improvement projects.
Amazing. Yeah, we had John Skivington, who's an advisor to Everwise, but also formerly the group director at LHC on a podcast previously. And he spoke about strategic enablements as a opportunity for procurement to come back to, rather than it being purely about cost cutting and cost savings, finding ways to bring that strategy element back into procurement in more of a profound way. And it sounds like there's a real opportunity in your area of procurement specifically, where you have a chance to do that, which is really exciting. And with it being a new and evolving space, as you say, only over the last 20 or so years that it's been there, what have been the major sort of challenges that you faced in that? Much of your background I saw when doing my prep on this is in consulting. So what lessons did you take from consulting when working client side? And were there anything that you gained from that you then were able to sort of use when be on the client side of that negotiation, perhaps when you're working with supply chain and those sorts of things?
Good question. I mean, I was very lucky. As I said, I was sent on lots of secondments that I probably wasn't professionally mature enough to do, but you have to learn, right? It's kind of sink or swim. So I had that traditional consultancy role, which I suppose is more akin to what I'm doing now, alternative real estate advisors. We are consultants and, we're trusted partners to our investor clients. But I also had the secondment experience of, actually building something within a client's office over the course of 2.5 years. Across opex, capex, new construction, not really the new construction procurement, but actually feeding into that mobilization and working with the construction team to mobilize the supply chain, to ensure that we are not invalidating warranties, to ensure that the on-site team, because this is operational real estate, is completely prepared and they know the building, they know where the lock is to unlock the fire curtain when it comes down. All of these tiny little things that are actually quite important that get completely lost in the construction handover. So that was really, really interesting. But then I've also worked in-house in a director of operations position for a build-to-rent portfolio that was mobilizing. And so that has been really, really interesting. I've kind of seen it across all of those. And I suppose to answer your question, the thing that I have learned and I'm trying to kind of feed into my work more and more is understanding the pain points and how to communicate those. So having been on the client side, I have been subject to many a pitch where it's not personalized. It's kind of a cookie cutter pitch. And, I even throughout the procurement process, I would kind of look at these pitches and kind of say, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with our building, And so I know that is already kind of a bit of a blocker on the client side. But the other thing is, in my ops director position, I would talk about pain points that we're going through, and I would talk about budget constraints, and I would talk about, all of these things are strategic objectives. And where we had a potential supply chain partner with whom really listened and crafted their solution, molded their solution around what we actually needed, that was really, really successful. And so I suppose how I've brought that learning over to Area is that we have a core suite of services, from audit and financial audit, procurement audit, where we'll identify savings opportunities, identify economies of scale that are that are opportunities. But then we also have that implementation. And so we've identified in the market that, most operators and investors and developers do not have an operational procurement team. So what myself and my team do is essentially plug in to that wider operational team. And it might be working with key stakeholders such as, a COO or a head of FM or a head of compliance and health and safety or a head of procurement that just doesn't have the resource to actually implement a lot of these projects. So I kind of feel like we serve as an engine to push those strategic procurement objectives, to achieve the savings, to achieve the partnerships that we need, or to achieve the improved compliance or the improved condition of the building. It's very much project based. And so we'll plug in and we'll have this whole engine of procurement professionals that know what they're doing, know the market, have really strong relationships with all of the specialist suppliers. And we'll do it, we'll run a whole sourcing process over 3 months and then negotiate the contracts and then mobilize them and hand them over to on-site teams and head office teams. And I think that that's where there's been a real gap in the market, because the reason that procurement hasn't evolved within our sector is because it costs a lot of money to create a corporate support team for procurement. And so it's often decentralized by its very nature, because somebody has to procure the service contracts and the framework agreements that are required from our third-party supply chain. And it often just gets left with a regional manager or a property manager. And so what you end up with is a portfolio of, say, 20 buildings with 10 different fire safety companies. 5 of those are national companies, like they could very well service your whole portfolio. But because the procurement has been kind of fragmented and localized, you're not achieving the economies of scale and you're not achieving that supply chain partnership. And it's a missed opportunity. So we'll come in, do that, and then hand over the keys to that supply chain relationship. Obviously, check back in, make sure that everything's fine. We'll act as a point of escalation because we have a very strong relationship with the supply chain. And that tends to work really, really well. And it means that our clients don't have to invest in a 4, 5, 6 person procurement team, which is obviously very expensive.
Definitely. Wow. And I suppose when it comes to the economies of scale, as you say, when you have an internal team like this, it might be less viable to really achieve that given the cost of having that internal team employed right the way through the life cycle of the project. So you're able to come in, provide this solution, provide this efficiency, and then also the strategic enablements of working with supply chain to reach an outcome, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could tell us more about this phrase that comes up quite a bit in procurement in your space, which is forensic analysis. What is that actually like? Let's say that you're opening up a portfolio for the first time. What are you reading in that first phase?
So there's forensic analysis from a quantitative perspective and from a qualitative perspective. So I'll start with the qualitative. The qualitative is essentially, how is our client approaching procurement? How are services and products being procured? What is the procurement attitude? What are the guardrails in place, such as supplier onboarding? What does the sourcing process look like? Is it a 3-stage sourcing process, or is it, hey, I really like these fire safety fellas. I use them at my last job. I'll get 2 other quotes because I have to get 3 quotes in this business, right? Or is it a proper sourcing process? And how long does it take? And how complete is it? So we'll do all of those kind of things. Is there supply chain performance management, supply chain relationship management? Are those features of best practice procurement part of that organizational kind of strategy, or actually are they missing? And is there room for improvement there? Is there room for training, particularly around cost control? Are we verifying invoices? Are we entering into contracts where we can actually check the reactive rate or the planned preventative maintenance rate for, say, I don't know, a boiler or a heat interface unit matches the contracted pricing? To what extent is that happening? And those are key elements of cost control. And when that cost gets out of control, it's very, very difficult to then make that organizational change to reintroduce those things. And oftentimes we're not signed up into contracts. When we do these audits and the forensic analysis, we'll identify that actually we're lacking those contracts. And so what that means is the price just fluctuates and you don't really have that kind of recourse, that contractual recourse to implement cost control. So you kind of have to go back to square one. On the quantitative side, we have an awful lot of data at Alternative Real Estate Advisors. So our procurement team, we have hundreds of thousands of lines of asset-specific bids that we have received over the years for over 100,000 BTR, PBSA, co-live units. And when I say asset-specific, I don't mean property-specific. I mean every asset in an asset register. So I'm talking about a planned preventative maintenance visit on a mechanical ventilation heat recovery unit. And we'll have, 5,000 bids for that exact same thing in different locations on different scales of procurement activity as well, so that we can see the effect of economies of scale on pricing on certain things. We can see where there are trends in the market with outsourcing. We can see how that trend increases the cost, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one data set that we have. But then at Area, we are, we're trusted partners for multiple investors and operators. And so we do have an awful lot of market data as well. What is the going rate in the market for common area cleaning, or for landscaping, or for high level access, planned preventative maintenance, or for risk assessments? And so we will take the client's opex budgets and actuals, go through line by line, ensure that they're mapped and coded properly, and then we'll do those 2 sets of comparison to say, okay, this is where you're over budget, over your own budget. And we think this is why, because we've had a look at the contracts, we've had a look at the supply chain relationship, and we know the approach to procurement in this area. This is where you sit against market. So you're overspending here, you're underspending here. How are these supply chain relationships where you're underspending? Is that a win? Or actually, is there room for improvement? Common area cleaning is a classic example. When we see that there's an underspend in common area cleaning in a luxury build to rent development, much like we're sat in now, then oftentimes the feedback from the site team is that, well, yeah, I mean, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And we have a lot of complaints from our residents because someone will spill a coffee in the lift and it will take 2 days to clean up, things like that. Now, that's not good when resident retention is also a key driver in our sector. And so there are so many insights that you can get from that you can derive from that analysis. But then we'll also then compare against the area procurement benchmarks, which is essentially what I like to call our maximum plausible outcome. We know that that's the best price that you can get for this comparable service. And that kind of allows us to demonstrate through data and through the qualitative analysis, the art of possible in terms of what would a procurement process look like for you and how would you prioritize it? Because you don't want to boil the ocean. Nobody's got time to do that. And so then we'll set priority 1/quick win, priority 2, priority 3, and then we'll indicate what a timeline would look like. Now, of course, a client is completely within their right to take that report and say, thank you so much for the insights. We're going to implement these internally. Fantastic. But most of the time, the insights from that report are actually reflective of the fact that they do not have a dedicated strategic procurement function internally. Or if they do have a procurement superstar, that procurement superstar doesn't have any sidekicks within the business, and they need some more resource to be able to implement those changes.
Which is where you come in.
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. Really fascinating stuff. It's interesting, as you mentioned, the areas where there could be underspend and there may be cause for concern there rather than it being a win. There may be an area that might be missing out. For example, on the common area cleaning, I was actually looking at a place recently and it was clear that, that wasn't really being done. So it was almost like an immediate no, really, because I didn't want to be walking through an apartment block that was never properly cleaned. So definitely understand that. When it comes to the areas of value that are perhaps overlooked, where are the main challenges in surfacing those? When you're doing this analysis, for example, and there's potential for more value to be gleaned of a specific area, what does that look like? How do you find those?
So I would say that most of the time, the area of value that is untapped, firstly, because, we'll do that comparison and then we'll say, well, we've just unlocked loads of value because we've understood that you're overspending to market. But actually, how do you then take that insight and evaluate it further and justify it further? A lot of the time it's through contract analysis and overscoping, unnecessary overscoping of contracts. And again, this goes back to the localization issue with procurement, especially on a new build. People without maybe a construction background or a facilities management background who are great with residents, they're great team leaders. They might not have the technical knowledge to be able to say, okay, well, I've got a building management system here and I need to go with the original equipment manufacturer. I've just been handed over this building, this beautiful, shiny new building with the roof terrace and the swimming pool and the sauna and the steam room. And it's wonderful. And I've got a great team. And now I've got the original equipment manufacturer talking to me in gobbledygook that I don't understand at all and telling me that I must have monthly visits on this building management system in order to optimize its performance. It's very, very difficult if you don't have that technical experience to be able to evaluate that, because that may very well be true, because you may be optimizing that BMS and creating savings on utilities, for example, because that BMS may control water temperature, for example, in line with demand in the building. So if we can demonstrate that there is a lower utilities cost and the BMS cost is slightly higher because we're paying for a qualified engineer to come once a month, then fine. But oftentimes that justification, we don't reach that justification. The property manager is really, really busy. and doesn't really want to deal with this. And so they go, okay, fine. Okay, that's what we've got. So what we find in this forensic analysis is that sometimes during the warranty period or the start of a building's life, it's kind of okay to do that. Not always, but it's kind of okay. 4 years, 5 years in, is it really necessary? And is it really necessary to stay with the original equipment manufacturer with whom you have a warranty when that warranty is expired? Actually, what we find is that we have this mobilization process, and we're sticking with the people that, or the subcontractors that actually installed these things, mostly out of concern for going elsewhere and invalidating warranties. But 2-3 years on, that's still our supply chain, and nobody's revisited it. And so that's where we find the biggest untapped opportunity, is that we have lots of these fragmented contracts. So if you imagine like a suite of fire safety systems within a building. You might have automatic opening vents. You've got fire doors. You've got, the fire alarm system, disabled refuge, all of these different systems, fire curtains, fire extinguishers, all of that makes up the fire safety protection of that building. But when we first open a building, there are lots of those things where we individually contract based on the system because we are nervous about invalidating warranties. And so we individually contract on a small scale with the original equipment manufacturer. That means two things. It means that you have a very small contract that doesn't really give you that much buying power or that opportunity to form a partnership with that supplier. It also means that a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, the original equipment manufacturer doesn't really, it's not, the maintenance and the aftercare isn't a core business for them. That's not where they make their money. They make their money through manufacturing and installing. So actually the performance or the incentivization for good performance isn't really there in the same way as a qualified facilities management company, where that is their main focus, that aftercare and the operational ongoing service of those systems. So we find that that's the biggest untapped opportunity, is that you might have 10 different fire safety or mechanical or electrical contracts because they've just been left there since mobilization.
And would you say that the untapped opportunities, as you describe, would they be common across the different areas that you've worked in? Because you've been in quite a few different areas, so co-living, student, BTR. What is the common elements between those when it comes to opportunity and ways to drive value?
I honestly think that those exist across all three of those asset classes, and there is so much commonality in terms of the opportunities. The other thing is that the supply chain that is set up to service those three different asset classes shares a lot of commonality as well. So oftentimes we will have investors that own PBSA, BTR, maybe co-live, and we can actually use the combined economies of scale of those. Whereas I think a lot of people might think, well, no, it's completely different. They're much more similar. It's a complete Venn diagram where there's a lot of overlap. And ultimately, we're talking about residential buildings, large-scale residential buildings. The operational management strategy and the resident demographic might differ. Does that mean that the supply chain needs to differ? Yes, to a certain extent. If you're going for high-end BTR, then you're going to have a different security, concierge, cleaning strategy, for example. Whereas if you're going for a more tech-based solution without that on-site customer service presence, and that's reflected in the rents, then maybe your strategy is a bit different. When it comes to hard FM, hard facilities management, and that's basically anything that's installed in the building, it's very similar. They're very similar construction projects.
Yeah, sounds like there's a lot of areas, as you say, of common sort of interest between those different groups. And this is very much the operational side of procurement. It's all post-construction. And what would you say has kept you focused on that? Because a lot of people would move across to the construction side or would do those sorts of procurement in the built environment, but you've stayed purely operational. What is it about that you specifically like the most, and what do you find is the most interesting?
I think it's the opportunity to drive value. And I kind of alluded to it earlier that, when you're working on a construction project, or maybe you're working on 2 or 3 developments at a time, there are economies of scale available. But actually, when you're working with a stabilized portfolio of 20,000 plus units, the opportunities for net operating income enhancement are through the roof. And we've found this, I mean, on all of our centralisation projects, we consistently save between 15 and 25% on the opex, just straight off the bat. And when in the cases where we're veering towards the 15%, normally that's because there's been an element of scope increase in some areas, where, you know, there was a pain point and actually the scope wasn't quite right for what needed to happen. So in some areas we'll have like landscaping is a good example, where if you do not have the correct frequency of landscaping visits and de-weeding and returfing and all of these things, actually that's going to impact the leasing journey and your ability to drive revenue from your asset, because that's your shop window, you know? And it's kind of, I always say, a quote from my mother is that, you know, if you go into a restaurant and you go into the toilets and the toilets are an absolute mess, you're like, what's the kitchen like? What's the bit like that I can't see? It doesn't instill confidence in your prospective residents or your current residents that, you know, you're trying to hold on to. Yeah,
definitely. Makes perfect sense. And as you said, the opportunity for driving the innovation there and for the, getting 15-25% reduction in OPEX is pretty exciting. And perhaps there is also the risk to mitigate when you're thinking about asset register and compliance. Not the most glamorous areas of concern, but really important things to keep in mind and to have a clear approach on. So what would you say are the main concerns? Should something slip through the cracks in that category? What can actually go wrong?
Yeah, good question. So let's explain what an asset register is first. So when we build an asset register, we have our surveyors essentially go and categorize every single building system, child and parent assets, and then also put a tag on each of those assets with a barcode or a QR code and a unique identifying number. And then that is fed into a spreadsheet, ready to be fed into a CAFM system, for example, or an e-procurement system or a health and safety management system. And that basically tells you the makeup of your building. It's important for two reasons. Firstly, when collecting warranties and O&Ms and testing and commissioning documents, all of those things, in today's world, in light of the Building Safety Act, it's so important that we retain the integrity of the golden thread of health and safety information. And that passport of that building from construction is very, very important, because it's what sets the tone for the compliance of that building once it's operational. And that's really, really key for sourcing projects. So when we are sourcing certain procurement lots, such as hard FM, you've got electrical, mechanical, fire, life safety, high level access, BMS, all of these different things, we will have that asset register as part of our bid submission sheet, with the make, the model, the manufacturer, the condition that asset is in. You know, you would hope that on a new build, the condition is always great, but actually the process of having an independent surveyor go to look at those assets, and if some of your assets come back with a condition B rating and you've only just achieved PC a month ago, it's a really good insight, because it allows you to go back to the principal contractor and say, guys, I think I'm a bit concerned about how this was installed. We've had this flagged by our surveyor. Please, could you take a look at it? So there's value in that already. But in terms of running that sourcing process, it's really, really key that to save time, that all of those vendors who are participating in the sourcing process understand exactly what the requirement is. They might be referring to a maintenance schedule like SFG 20, for example, and giving a bid for statutory versus business best practice. But actually, it's really, really key for them to be able to look at a spreadsheet and go, cool, I've got a really good understanding of this building before I've even visited. And so then when you're running site visits, which is often advisable anyway, sometimes we can skip the site visits if the asset register is great, and particularly if your vendors have a really good knowledge of that portfolio already, and maybe you might do a sample size, you know, like send the supply chain to 5 different buildings, you know. But it's once the vendor does get to site, they already understand exactly what's in that building, and it's kind of a whistle-stop tour rather than moving in and spending 2 months getting to know the building, which is obviously going to delay the sourcing process, which is going to delay the ultimate savings achievement.
Absolutely. Yeah. Making sure that that is all fitting into the scope of what you're trying to achieve before you go into the larger piece of work in the long term. Initially focusing on asset register compliance, as you say, super important to get those things right. When you're working with investors, what do you find is the thing that they perhaps don't get right away when it comes to this side of procurement that you're engaged in? And what is often misunderstood that you have to sort of take them on a journey to understand?
Firstly, what is procurement? A lot of people don't really understand the importance of strategic procurement, particularly at a portfolio level, and the potential opportunity that can be unlocked there. So it's about taking an investor on that journey, and the audit comes into that. So, we provide very cost-effective audits with all of these insights. And that is often really, really key in bringing an investor around to our way of thinking, because we can stand behind a number that we've said, you could save this much just on this building. Across the whole portfolio, you could save this much. In our industry, you save £1 on the opex and you add £20 to the valuation of the building. So that kind of that messaging, once it becomes a real number that's based on their portfolio or that's based on that specific building that they own and operate, that's where it becomes very, very compelling. So yeah, if I had my way, I would always be able to do an audit such that, the message resonates very, very clearly. But I think we've got a long way to go in order to kind of change or to improve the way that strategic procurement is recognized and valued in our sector. I think in commercial real estate, I did do a brief stint in commercial real estate and then thought, gosh, what am I doing? I'm from a really niche background that in a sector that's growing exponentially. And I've just moved away from it into commercial real estate. I better get back, which is why I took the internal director of operations position. But yeah, I think there are other sectors that we can learn from that really do value strategic procurement, and commercial real estate is one of them.
Yeah. And I imagine that for investors, seeing that opportunity to have the increase in value as a result of the analysis that then follows with a procurement process would be pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, we met at the SIPS AI Beyond the Hype events quite recently, and the noise around AI procurement is getting, louder and louder. In your world, buying and supplier management, operational procurement, what do you see the potential for new tech, and what perhaps usage of AI do you currently use in your organization?
Yeah, so it is a hot topic at the moment, and it's something that I've been quite nervous about, to be honest. I think that we need a measured approach. There are elements of the procurement process that are lengthy and that delay those savings achievements or the, supply chain performance achievements or the compliance increases that we're looking for, such as the pre-qualification stage, where actually we want to go out to as much of the supply chain as we possibly can to give us some optionality, particularly on a geographically varied portfolio. And so sometimes we will end up going to 300-400 vendors in that initial stage. We want it to be really, really easy for a vendor to express their interest. We don't want to ask for inside leg measurements, but we want to ensure that that vendor has the right experience, the correct insurance levels, and any relevant qualifications or certifications that are required to deliver that service for our clients. Now, that's a relatively two-dimensional and rudimentary process. It's essentially data gathering and then data analysis. We want to make it as easy as possible for the vendor to do that, particularly if you're going to a wider portion of the supply chain. We want to make it as easy as possible for the procurement team to analyze those results such that we can select who goes into stage 2, who are the right partners. And if you don't have the right level of public liability insurance, that's quite an easy It's quite an easy way to say, okay, well, I don't think that you would be the right vendor to service this portfolio. If you've never had operational real estate experience, but that's a key thing for our client, then we know already that that's not going to be the case. So I think AI is very helpful, and we've certainly harnessed it to aid in those more admin heavy tasks. Where I am nervous about AI is when it comes to data protection, but also when it comes to that negotiation and really having a human understanding of the vendor from a business development perspective, of the client from what they're trying to achieve, and actually of what levers can I pull in this procurement process because I understand the business development strategy for that supplier. So for example, could I, they can only service the Northwest, for example. Could I negotiate slightly lower pricing by combining two procurement categories, by combining mechanical and electrical, by combining fire safety systems and fire doors, for example. So we're giving them more business, albeit in a smaller region. It's those strategic things that actually rely on a more kind of cerebral understanding of what's going on and what's driving that pricing activity. And also building that relationship such that you can negotiate and then you can secure a really good supply chain partnership going forward and set your client up for success with working with that vendor. I'm nervous about the depersonalization of the procurement practice through AI, and a little bit nervous around how do we implement the correct levels of governance and what are the correct levels of governance. I think it's really early and I think we need to be cautious. But for the more admin tasks, particularly in the early stages of the procurement process, there is no reason why you cannot make that more efficient through agentic AI.
Certainly. That's what we found, especially with our software, using it in an appropriate way. Like you say, not dehumanizing the procurement process, making sure there's always a human in the loop and finding a way for the collaboration to happen more seamlessly between partners, clients, the procurement team you might be working with, and then of course on your side on the team internally. And that's pretty exciting, especially when it comes to those areas of the process that can be perhaps more not completely automated, but driven by operational efficiency more so than others. So really exciting. Grace, thank you so much for your time today. It was really, really interesting to go over your experience and to see your view and your approach to procurement. Where can people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can head to the website arealtd.co.uk, and there you can explore our investment and brokerage side of the business, as well as our asset management or asset oversight side of the business. That team is really interesting. They also run PMA tenders, so property management tenders, where they will match an investor with the right operator, third-party operator for them. Super compelling. And then obviously all of my procurement stuff and my great team.
Incredible. Thanks so much.
Thanks.